Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. If you want to learn how to write horror, I have the perfect video for you today. I recently had the pleasure of interviewing young adult horror author Dawn Kurtagich. Dawn's award-winning debut, The Dead House, was a Young Adult Library Services Association's top 10 pick and has also been optioned for television by Lime Productions. Dawn is also the author of And the Trees Crept In, which is also known as The Creeper Man in the UK, as well as Teeth in the Mist, which were published by Little Brown Books for Young Readers, as well as Orion children's books. Dawn and I had such a wonderful conversation about how to build creepy atmosphere in your horror, how to use details, how to use found text to create really unsettling stories, and I personally learned so much from talking to Dawn, and I know you will too. Make sure that you watch this video until the end, because at the end of this video, Dawn shares what she believes to be the secret of writing truly effective, scary horror. So if you want to learn how to write horror, stick around and check out this interview. Let's welcome Dawn Kurtagich to the channel. Awesome. So Dawn, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to have you on the channel. Could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name's Dawn Kurtagich and I write YA horror, sort of a more psychological and gothic bent rather than slashers or murder mysteries. I've written 3 novels, The Dead House and The Trees Crept In, which is called The Creeper Man in the UK, and Teeth in the Mist. There's also an e-novella sequel to The Dead House called NAIDA, which is out. A lot of people don't realize this, so I thought I'd mention it. And yeah, that's basically me.
Could you tell us a little bit about what initially drew you to horror? Is that always what you wanted to write?
So I have an interesting relationship with horror. Generally, I like extreme things anyway. I think I'm just built that way, and I love sensation. So I was raised with horror. I had a very interesting upbringing. We traveled a lot. One period of time during my life, we lived in the African bush, which was pretty scary. But I think my first introduction to horror actually was when I was 5. So my first introduction to commercial horror, I was 5. And it was the film The Prince of Darkness, the John Carpenter film.
Oh, okay.
Did you ever see that one? It's like an 80s film and it's not suitable for 5-year-olds. It's about...
I haven't seen it. I've heard of it though. I've heard it's so very scary.
The soundtrack is just brilliant, but it's essentially about a group of scientists who discover this vat of swirling green goo in, I think, a basement of a university or some isolated place. And it turns out to be the portal to hell, and the Antichrist is trying to come through to bring the devil through. And it involves like a clip from the future from 1999 of the devil appearing in the world, and it piqued my interest. I was terrified and delighted, and I think that was probably my first foray, closely followed by It, the TV movie.
Oh yeah.
I saw that when I was also like 5, and I was just really intrigued. So that was my introduction to horror.
A lot of the other horror authors that I've been talking to have mentioned that they are really very, very scared of horror and self-identify as giant scaredy cats, but also are just really fascinated. Does it scare you when you write horror?
I'm a total scaredy cat. I'm scared of it. And I think it's really fascinating actually, because I've done panels with authors who aren't scared of anything, and they write horror, and that there's this perpetual quest for the thing that scares them because they just don't feel afraid. I'm like afraid of the dark. I'm afraid of stupid things. Like I go to bed at night, I have to turn the light off downstairs and then run upstairs. And I'm just like, I just imagine creepy hands like reaching for me. It's just my mind races with horror imagery all the time. There's probably, I need a therapist, but my writing is my therapy.
Well, I think as writers, you have such vivid imaginations, especially as a horror author. You must be able to really, if you're running up the stairs, you can imagine all those creepy things that could be lurking in the dark as if you were writing a story. So it makes it a little bit scarier. If you didn't have such a vivid imagination, it wouldn't probably be as bad.
It's the potential for things, right? So I'm also one of these people who's like, I choose to believe in things. Whether or not I actually do is another question, but I like to think that I believe in things like ghosts and fairies. I just love the idea of possibility. And so, yeah, just the potential that there's something unknown, something hidden that I can't perceive. And also, I'm interested in astrophysics, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later, but for a while I thought I would go into physics, and so I'm interested in theory of parallel universes and things that we can't perceive, right? So this all feeds into horror for me.
Yeah, definitely. That also very well forays into the next question of, did you always know that you wanted to be a writer?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in retrospect, if I were to look back from where I am now, I think it's obvious that I couldn't have done anything else as well as I've done writing. I don't think that I'm made for anything as well as I'm made for storytelling. And I can look back at my life and see clues, you know. And I think, but for a long time, I really did think I would go into astrophysics, and I studied to that effect. I did a placement when I was like 15 or 16 with the Cavendish laboratories in Cambridge, fully expecting that I would then go on to university and do astrophysics, except that when I got there, I realized that I was more interested in the romance of it. I was more interested in the story of space rather than the mathematical reality. I did this amazing placement, and it seemed romantic to me at the time. And I went into these hobbit holes in the ground where they had these observatories with these giant telescopes, the Coast Telescope. And I was meeting with these PhD students who'd been doing their PhD for like 15 years because they were waiting for one astronomical event to happen for their PhD.
Wow.
So I'm sitting there talking to them, they're explaining the machines, and then all of a sudden the machines go wild. They just start beeping and all these papers start spewing out. And it's like this amazing cinematic moment. And it passes, and then I'm like, that's amazing, they're so happy. I'm like, you can get on, you know, now what's the next step? And he's like, well, now I spend the next 30 years analyzing the data.
Oh, wow.
In that instant I was like, nope, that's not for me. Like, I just can't, you know, like it's the romance of it that I'm looking for. It's the story. And I realized it was a passing phase. So yeah, I think that I'm looking for the story in whatever I'm doing.
Did that epiphany happen around the time that you were in college?
No, I was about 15, 16. I was still in high school. So yeah, I did that, and then I had to go and do a report. And I enjoyed the writing of the report, but not the actual content. And I had always been writing. So I started my first novel when I was 12. My mother brought this beautiful leather hardbound journal to back from Boston on a business trip that she went to. She traveled all the time. And I just remember starting a story, and it was completely melodramatic. It was about these women, and one of them was kidnapped and tortured, and then they get together and get superpowers and go and seek revenge. And but I just enjoyed the writing. It was terrible, but I continued writing in this leather-bound book all throughout high school. I finally finished the book when I was 17, but it still hadn't clicked for me that this could be a career, because I didn't come from a literary family. I didn't know publishing. And I don't think I really grasped the fact that you could do this as a profession. So I always thought that maybe I would do it part-time, or like, you know, it would be a side thing. And it was when I was 19, I was studying at university and just hating my course. By this time I switched to economics after I realized astrophysics wasn't going to be for me, and I didn't get the grades for that anyway. So I was doing business, and it was actually my husband, he was my boyfriend at the time. He said to me, look, you have to dare to be yourself. I was in this real moment of crisis. I was just afraid. I was afraid of not being good enough, and I was afraid of not being worthy, I think. And he said, you just have to dare to be yourself. And I said, fine, I will. I switched to an English literature degree, not because I had to, because you don't need a degree to write, just because it better suited me. And I started working on novels from that moment on. So I was 19 when I made the choice to actively pursue it.
What did you find was most helpful to you when you were learning how to write?
Well, my education was very scattered. So I went to 15 different schools in both hemispheres.
Wow.
And so a lot of the time my curriculum was repeated. There were chunks that overlapped and there were chunks that were missing. So I actually had a very broken education. And I also was massively dyslexic. I am dyslexic. And so I didn't really read. My mum is a huge bookworm, and she would constantly bring me these books and try to get me to read, but I just wasn't interested. until and she would do things like she would make me read to her at the end of work. She'd be like, oh, I'm so tired, please, I've got to read this thing, can you please like read it to me? And she would try and trick me into reading out loud. And I'm forever grateful for that, because one day eventually she bought me a book called Animorphs by Applegate, K.A. Applegate, right?
Are those the series of like the person that slowly turns it? Yeah, I loved those books.
Yeah, I love those, right? So, and something clicked. Because before she'd been buying me like contemporary books about girls who moved to new continents, or like horsey books, or like the new girl books, and I just did not care for realism. And that will be a theme, I think, in this interview. Like, I don't care for realism very much. So she bought me this Animorphs, and I was like, kids absorbing alien DNA and getting these magical powers, like, yes. It's like conspiracy of these alien yerks that are trying to like, I was sold. And very quickly moved on to Goosebumps and things. So my education in terms of writing really came from books themselves. Aside from that, I mostly taught myself about the craft of writing, because again, I didn't know where to start. So I went to Google, as people do. And I learned from other people in the industry. My first agent was hugely instrumental. It took me 7 years to get an agent. And I learned a lot from her edits on my manuscripts. Learning, okay, like this is a passive sentence. I didn't learn this stuff. I didn't learn about craft. I didn't learn what a passive sentence was. I didn't know about weak verbs. I didn't know about these things. I knew, metaphor, alliteration, or, the regular things, but the craft of writing itself, I had to seek out these answers, because you can't learn something when you don't know what you're looking for. You can't learn from absence. So other people in the industry taught me a lot. And then afterwards, I learned from those skills by reading books. And I have read craft books, but I'm generally averse to prescriptive advice, because I think that it rarely works for everyone. People write different things for different people and at different times in their lives. So I do think it's worth knowing the techniques, but I can tell you what works for me and how I learned from myself, and you can then go and try that. But it's not necessarily going to be the thing that works for you. I spent years doing that, listening to other authors telling me how to do things, and then discovering that that's just not how my brain worked.
Yeah, well, I think, as you said, writing is such an individualized process. Like, nobody can teach you how to write. You have to just be willing to experiment with everything that you hear and see what works for you.
Yeah. And that's why it's so difficult, right? Writing is hard. Like, people say like, oh, I'll do it when I have time, or like, I'll do it as a hobby. And even I had that attitude until I started. And then you realize, well, this is why it takes time, because you're also, I think learning to write is really learning about yourself, right? It's looking in and experimenting with things that work for how your brain ticks along. So again, anything I say in this will be how I function, and should be taken with a grain of salt at all times.
Well, it's like that's why it's hard when you've got people taking courses saying, oh, I'm going to take this one course from this one author and they're going to teach me how to write. And it's like, well, you can't really have anybody else teach you. You just have to be open.
Yeah, I'm not against authors doing courses. I've got friends who offer courses, but I think that it should come with the caveat that this is what works for them and this is a method. The other thing is, not every method has worked for every book that I've written. So I've got 3 published, but I've written many more that have not seen the light of day.
Right.
And each one of them, I'm like learning how to do it from scratch every time, which is deeply frustrating. It's like, why can't there just be a system, and then I can just get on with things and it will just be the same every time and it would be easy.
Well, if the stories you're telling are so different, I imagine like you would need a different process to tell different stories, because different stories need to be told in different ways and using different like tenses, and you use like found text and stuff. Like, there are different methods for telling different stories. So.
Absolutely. And also you change as you get older. My brain does not function. Okay, so I've got an added element. So I had a liver transplant when I was like 24, 25. And so my brain is no longer the same as it was before all the drugs that I'm on that keep me alive. So the way that I think has changed over time. And I expect that's true of most people. They say something like writers on average peak at 60 or something. So you've got this whole lifetime to learn and to grow and to change how you output and input.
Yeah, definitely. So As you know, as a horror author, horror as a genre is a lot of the times not defined by, but includes like a lot of tropes, and horror tropes are very kind of important to the definition of a horror genre. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether you like to use tropes, how you interact with tropes. Do you like inverting them? Do you ever build stories around them?
Okay, the thing about tropes is that it depends on what you're going for as an author, and it also depends on the kind of reader that you're catering for. So you'll never satisfy everyone, but so I'm all for realism, and I mentioned this earlier, but I'm not reading to read about reality for the most part. So I read because I want to escape. I want dragons and giants and ghosts and, you know, magic boxes and forbidden things. So I read for escapism. But at the same time, you need to, there's an element, you have to suspend your disbelief as a reader. You have to, when you're watching something or reading something, you have to be able to suspend your disbelief. But I also need to believe that what I'm watching is plausible, right? So for me, it comes usually in the form of characters, and a trope for me might exist if it makes sense for the character and in the world. So for me, fiction is like this delicate balance between realism and what you can get away with, essentially. So here's an example. So a lot of YA has this trope of the parents being dead, right? As a 13-year-old kid, that was like music to my ears, because I didn't want to read a book where a kid had the safety net of their parents. I wanted to see, could they do the mission? Could they do this thing without that, without the bondage or safety net of their parents? So that was a trope that I was really into as a kid. But a lot of people don't like that trope in YA because it's not very realistic, but it fed a need that I had as a child.
Right.
So again, with tropes, I think it just depends on what you as an author like. For the most part, I'm just writing for me. And when I'm writing YA, I'm writing for the person I was and kind of still am. So, and I think also that if I did write tropes, I had no idea that I was doing it, because I only learned these things in retrospect.
Right.
Horror tropes. Let me think about this. I think if you're going to use a trope, have it make sense in the world that you're building, have it make sense for the characters that you're going to do. I don't think there's anything wrong with tropes, but a trope for a trope's sake is just boring. I mean, the found footage thing in horror is a trope. I've done it. Conjuring evil is a trope in horror. I've done that. Being alone in a dark house, that's a trope in horror. I've done it, but I didn't do it to have the trope. I did it because being alone in a house at night in the dark scares me. And it made sense to put a character in that situation. Conjuring evil is something that both fascinates and scares me. I would never conjure some demon, but I sure as hell I'm going to be entertained by someone else doing it. I want to see how bad it's going to get. I want to see. It's like the perverse thing. If you see a car accident, you look, you know, you're like, oh, I have to be respectful. You're like, is there blood? So long as it makes sense, don't do tropes for tropes' sake. Unless, of course, you're interested in something. Say you pick a trope. I don't know, the girl who runs upstairs instead of fleeing the house. Maybe it's because you just are curious to see why the hell someone would do that. Then go for it. If you're doing it from a spirit of curiosity, I'm all for it. So I guess do what works for you in the story.
Do you have a book of yours that scares you the most?
I think if you'd asked me while I was writing, I would have said the one that I was writing was the one that scared me the most. So I write for my own curiosity, but also sort of for my own therapy. And I've had readers write to me to express that it had that effect on them as well. And because of that, I think that there's this catharsis for me of putting out a book and then it closing and I'm like done with it. So during the process of writing it, I'm very afraid for a multitude of reasons, both for the actual story, but also because of industry things like, how is this going to perform? Is anyone going to resonate with anyone? But then when it's done, I've kind of closed the chapter on the fear. And then it's just this like thing that I'm proud of and that exists external to myself. So I guess that's the answer. The one I'm working on is the one that scares me the most.
How do you go about approaching building creepy atmosphere in your books? Because atmosphere is such a not concrete concept. Like there isn't one thing that you can do to create atmosphere that's really scary and suffocating and that like clings to readers' minds. Is there anything that you recommend doing to approach building an atmosphere that is really scary and unsettling?
So here's the thing with me. I did all of this instinctively. And that's generally how I approach life. It's so unhelpful. I will do a thing, and my husband's very analytical, and I'm surrounded by authors who are very analytical, who know their process, who know all of the ins and outs of why they do things. I'll do something and then have to think about why. So this is what I've come up with over the years. I know that I use my senses. So I remember I was writing, I think it was Teeth in the Mist. And I was lacking that. I was lacking a sense of unease and atmosphere in the book, and I didn't understand why. So this is a book about a group of people who are in this mansion, this crumbling mansion in the Welsh hills where I live, in the 19th century. So I was like, okay, fine. I did two things. One, I'm terrified of the dark, so I went outside, and I think I filmed it actually, stupidly, because I thought, why not? So I did an Instagram live, but I was outside and I was in the dark and I closed my eyes, which was the most terrifying thing ever, because I'm just in an isolated cottage at the time that was on a hill surrounded by woods, and it was deathly alone. And all you can see is like, if a car passes, all you can see is the gleaming eyes of the sheep, like dotted around the landscape. So I stood there and I was like, okay, I'm afraid, but why? And what does that feel like? I was trying to analyze what was happening with my body. And what I realized was that everything was super heightened in my senses. So I used that in my writing. The second thing I did was I sat in my living room, I turned off the electricity, and I put a candle on in a lamp that I have. And I noticed the way that the flames made the pattern of the lamp dance on the wall. And this was deeply unnerving to me. And I tried to figure out why. And it was because it created images in the shadows and suggestions of things. It was nothing overt, but it was the suggestion of things. So that's what I do. I use my senses, all of them, including smell. I shrink things down to the smallest details in a moment of fear. Not when I'm setting things up, because that'll be boring. But if a person's afraid, I shrink things down to minutia. And then I just pay attention to sensations. The other thing I do is, so I read the world in an emotionscape. So I use my words to paint an emotionscape. Right. So I choose words that have associations in emotion, or so each word might have 1,000 words associated with it. If I say, for example, I could say that a cupboard stood in the corner of the room, or I could say that it loomed from the corner like a miasma, or like a rising shadow. Like I can use each sentence to create a feeling of dread. Somebody once said to me, I think it was in a comedy show, that there is a fine line between comedy and horror, but both use the same technique. You can make a sentence funny or terrifying just with the words that you choose and how you frame it. So I pay attention to those small details and I use them to create an emotionscape and a sensationscape.
How do you choose when to describe things using all the senses? Because I think, like, if I'm imagining doing that myself, and I worry that if I were to try to focus on all 5 sentences at all times when I'm trying to describe scenes, that I would have really, really long descriptions that wouldn't be moving the character through the scene fast enough. Do you have any ways that you're able to decide when you want to use the senses and when you don't?
Yeah, so what I do is I just paint with a general brush. So I might mention the smell of mildew, but I may not mention anything else. I might have a character walk into a room and there be a peculiar taste in the air. It doesn't have to be all senses at all times. It's just to give it a bit of qualitative interest, a bit of what's the word I'm looking for? Juice, flavor. So, I mean, when I usually describe things the most is when, so for example, in Teeth is when the character first comes to a place. And actually, I don't have huge descriptive paragraphs. It really is just the key choice of words. Actually, a book that does this really well that I think everyone should read is Perfume. Okay. The book Perfume, Patrick Suskind, right? So that is the book that taught me to use senses, and particularly the sense of smell. So it's a book about a boy who was born, I think in 19th century France, I can't remember the date, but he has this incredible sense of smell, but he also has no emotions, and he ends up being this horrible killer. But the description of the smells makes you feel like I'm there in this fetid, marketplace, or in this perfumed parlor. But he doesn't do it overtly. It's just the suggestion, just a brush, a lick of paint here and there. Because the other thing is, you've got to trust your reader to fill in the details. You're just giving them tiny little tags to focus on. So you'll just put a tiny word in there, of which a whole blossom of imagination will come from them, and they will fill in the architecture of what you built.
When you edit your books, do you usually do a whole pass for language? What does your editing process look like? Do you start with plot and then kind of move on to the actual language that you use to tell the story, or do you have a different process?
Yeah, inevitably I do plot first. The reason is because I might change things and delete whole sections, so there's no point in me having beautiful prose and language and focusing on that if a scene's not going to be there. Yeah. So, and a lot of the times after you're published, it's dictated by your edit letter anyway. So a lot of times what will happen is your edit letter, you'll have several passes of edits. So you'll have the world building edit first. It's like the big things, then they'll send an edit letter for smaller things. Before I was published, I did it in stages like this anyway, because when you have a finished novel and you're like, right, I have to edit this beast into shape, it's terrifying. You have to do it in layers. Otherwise it's like, oh my God, I have to climb this entire mountain in one giant leap. No chance. So tend to do world building things first, although nowadays a lot of that work happens before I start. Then I do character layer things, and it really the word level is my last step, when I'm pretty happy with how it is and it's pretty polished.
Do you like to outline your books in advance?
I started as a pantser completely, because again, I didn't know anything about writing, and some people it comes to how different people write. I've got friends who need to pants an entire novel and get it completely wrong before they realize what they need to do. I suppose I'm a bit of a hybrid, because I will have core scenes that I know are there, and I'll sort of work my way to each stepping stone. I think also it's different for different books. So the last book I just finished, that one I had a chapter by chapter summary. So I knew exactly what was happening the entire way through the book. And that took a bit of getting used to, but now that I've done it, I'm thinking I might even try and keep doing it, because a lot of the work was then done before I even started. I didn't write myself into plot holes. I think possibly I could write faster that way. But again, you see, I'm still experimenting. I'm still discovering. I might start the next book and realize that there's no chance that's going to work for me this time.
Is there a certain plot structure that you like following, or is there a certain plot structure that you think is very helpful when trying to write a horror book, or certain plot beats that you think are particularly important in horror?
I think it's good to know about specific structure and formula. So for example, I know how to use the 3-act structure, 8-sequence structure. I know about Save the Cat. I've read many different craft books, and what I found is that I take pieces from each of them, but I never fit myself into the mold of them entirely. I think possibly it's because I write horror, and the reason is because, especially with the type of horror that I write, I'm trying to push the boundaries because I don't want to get bored, and I'm curious. So for example, Teeth in the Mist has a 5-act structure. It started as a 3-act structure. I thought it would be a 3-act structure novel. In fact, I started with a board with 8 sequences on a board, and I tried to plug in the scenes that I knew I had with a post-it note onto the board, and it ended up just not fitting that mold. Most stories do have a 3-act structure, and I think that if you pick out any film or any book, you could probably break it down into a 3-act structure. I think probably what I'd say is learn how to do it and then try and break some rules if you want.
How do you work on pacing with your books? Because with horror books, you want to make sure you have forward momentum and keep your readers turning pages to some extent anyway. Do you find that following a structure helps you keep it paced quickly enough to keep readers interested, or do you have other strategies that you employ to keep readers turning pages?
I think there's something familiar about a 3-act structure that people subconsciously respond to. It's safe. I think for me personally, I tend to keep my chapters short. I just naturally write that way. Someone once told me, actually, it was one of these like prescriptive pieces of advice that people hand out, but at the time I was just absorbing it all. But someone said to me, and I can't remember who, that you should have 5 quotable lines per page of your book when you submit to agents. And I was like, oh, holy shit, like I need to, excuse my French, but I need to like 5 quotable, right, okay, so like I need to do this. So I did it. And yeah, The Dead House is the book I did this with, and it's still my most quoted novel of the ones that I've written. So possibly there's something to that. This is what I'm saying, like, you know, this was just some throwaway piece of advice that someone gave me one time. I used it and then it ended up being great. But there have been other times when that's not happened. I think probably for me, it's mostly about authentic emotion. Like I don't want characters to feel and then react in a way that's is unnatural. And I want to feel like I trust the person who's writing the book to take me on this journey, that I'm well in hand. And I think if you can do that with your readers, and again, it's subjective, isn't it? How you do that is subjective. And it's such a lame answer, because it would be so much easier if it was just like, yeah, do this one thing and then it will be great.
Yeah, no, it's completely subjective, which is why it's so interesting. Like this week, I've been talking to a couple of horror authors and asking kind of some similar overlapping questions, and people's answers have been completely different. So it's been so interesting to hear about people's different processes. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I had a lot of trouble for many years, because most of the authors who at the time were giving interviews that I was watching or listening to were people who have very logical, rational, linear ways of working and thinking. But I'm not like that. I'm very instinctive. I'm very emotional. I do things and then think about why. So, but I wasn't seeing that reflected in any interview. But now I know why, because it's not very interesting to say, well, you've got to play around. It's not very interesting to say, look into yourself to find the answer, because that puts the onus on the writer to actually do the work, instead of, well, here's this path that I've laid for you already.
You briefly mentioned Dead House in the previous question answer. I'd love to talk to you a little bit about how you went about building that book and crafting that book, because you use found text and all of these really creative different pieces of media to form this story, because you have like the diary entries and you have the descriptions of the video and all these different things. How did you first go about plotting and approaching forming this narrative across all of these different pieces of media?
Yeah, that was a challenge. I remember saying to somebody that it was like trying to sort out like cotton thread that had become tangled up. It was such a I feel so grateful for my copy editor, because the amount of, like, I got the manuscript back and it was just riddled with red everywhere, like just fact checking things. But initially when I started The Dead House, it was going to be diary entries alone. It was just going to be Caitlin's diary entries. And that was a conscious choice, because I had read books that were just diary entries, like the Rose Manor one, and like Carrie, that was like found footage, but also The Perks of Being a Wallflower. I love this idea of like letter writing as an intimate thing. I'm a lifelong journalist, like journaler, diarist. So I had this intimate need to tell a story from the perspective of someone's most secret experience. And the reason is because I had just gone through this transplant, and I was trying to make sense of things. So it was almost like writing to myself. But then I reached a point where I needed Caitlin to be unaware of something that was happening. So I couldn't have her, you can't tell a story with diary entries with the person writing them not knowing things. The other thing I ended up discovering that I loved was the conflict between what someone says in a diary entry and how they act in, for example, a video transcript where it's describing their actions.
Yeah.
The other thing that was interesting to me, it's all psychology to me, was with a video transcript, for example, you can't divine the reasons for someone's actions. You can only guess at them from facial expressions and what they're physically doing, but I'm not in their head like a traditional narrative structure would be. Whereas with the diary, I can't see what they're doing necessarily, but I know exactly what they're thinking and feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So I really wanted to play with that interplay, that contrast, and what does it mean and what does it say when those things don't align? And that's kind of how it started.
Did you have any process for deciding which moments you wanted to be told in diary entry and which moments you wanted to be told in the video footage or the notes from the doctors or the back and forth between the therapist and Caitlin? Did you have any process for deciding which moments had to be told in which mediums?
Yeah, it was just a practical nature. So for example, if something needed to be shown with the doctor, it made more sense for the doctor to say it herself in the diary entry rather than writing a diary entry where she's describing the interaction. And similarly, if I needed to reveal something that Caitlin was not privy to, again, it made more sense for a video footage. Or, for example, if something needed to happen where no one is in the scene, which I found personally deeply unsettling, like filming of an empty room where something strange happens, that just made sense that it would be a video footage. And actually, I wasn't going to have any sort of interview tapes or anything. It was just the necessity of the information I needed to get across that dictated the medium that was chosen.
When you were outlining, did you make note of what needed to be revealed and when in an outline for that book, or did you not outline as much for the book? How did you build it?
I didn't outline for that book, and
That's so impressive.
Yeah, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. The only thing I knew about the book when I started was that Caitlin existed at night and Carly existed during the day. That's the only thing I knew. And I was finding my way through the story. And I remember I was nearly at the end and I had no idea what was going to happen, because I was discovering the story at the same time. And the thing about outlining because I outline now all the time because you have to if you want to sell on proposal, right? So it's a necessity of the publishing industry. But I miss that feeling of discovering the story as it happens, but it takes 5 times as long. Right. So really the last time I got to do that was with The Dead House. And God, I don't even know how I did that now. I think it's because by the time I had my agents, I had revised that book to absolute death. And then we revised it once or twice with my agent. And then again, so that's like probably my most edited book.
How do you not lose motivation when you're not writing with an outline? I always feel that I'm losing steam if I get to about the middle of the book and I don't know where I'm going next and everything is overwhelming and I don't know where I am.
I've definitely felt that. But again, it comes down to what inspires you. So if I could ask you, like, what is it that makes you write? For me, it's curiosity. I need to know what happens. It's like a compulsion. And so that was what kept me going, but also because I knew I wanted to be published. I was so determined to, I'd had the second chance of life. I'd started writing it actually when I was waiting for transplant, and I finished it after transplant, but I was so determined not to waste the time I'd been given, this precious gift. So that is kind of tied into my motivation, but mostly it's a sense of curiosity. Yeah, I mean, I could ask you, what is it for you that keeps you writing? Like, why do you do it at all?
I was not expecting to be asked any questions.
See, this is just, it's because one day someone will ask you this and you may not know. Like, I didn't know. I'm exactly like you. I would just do things and then someone asked me, like, oh, no, I need to think about it. I have no idea. Yeah. And I think I bungled my first couple of interviews because I was like, I don't know. So yeah, like it's just one of those things. And because people are so curious about why we do these things and how, I think maybe they're looking for the common thread, like with most things. But for me, it's just the curiosity. So, and in fact, I've actually bitten myself in the foot where I have plotted and then been bored because I know what's coming and it's like, oh, I have to write the scene, but I know what's there already. So it's constant battles in some ways.
Yeah, I do feel when I have an outline, it's easier to get to the end, but a lot of the times my ending will change and then I'll go back and I'll have to redo everything. And I don't know, I think maybe just the safety of knowing what's going to happen at the end gives me a place to go, but then the place can always change.
Exactly. But. And actually that's happened where I've sold a book on spec. So I've given it a synopsis. I did this with And the Truth Person. That book, the only thing that was the same was the ending, because that's the only thing I had for the book at the time. I think it was that one. Might have been Teeth. Anyway, but you know, it changed. And so yeah, if that makes you feel safe, and I definitely recognize that feeling, completely do it. But then you know that you have the freedom to say to hell with it and do your own thing anyway if you want to.
When I was reading Dead House, I was just so morbidly curious the whole time how you formatted that manuscript when you submitted it. Was it, how did you do it? Did you just write, like, where did you include any images? Did you like use Photoshop to make mock-up images to put in the manuscript?
So actually no. So the way it worked with both the Dead House and the Trees Crept In, I especially for And the Trees Crept In, I had my own design images, but no one ever saw them. I could probably release them, but they're not very good. But
Well,
with the Dead
bonus
House,
materials.
yeah, exactly. Like maybe in a future edition, like these are the crappy things that the author thought would be cool. With the Dead House, I literally just, in square brackets at the top of the page, I would put design notes. So I literally have open square bracket, design note, colon. I'd say things like, this is a diary entry, it's NAIDA's diary entry, it should be formatted the same as all the diary entries. And so I do that to this day. And it just occurred to me to do that. No one told me to, but I knew that it had to look a certain way. And I knew that certain things, the clue was in the formatting rather than what was said. So that's how I did it for those two. But for Teeth, I said to my editor, look, I really want to source the artwork and do some of the artwork myself. So for that book, I provided the artwork and the illustrations and all those things. And then they formatted it all together into the finished book. So I've had both experiences.
Do you have a point of view that you like to write in that you think is the scariest?
So I enjoy writing in all of them, but I think probably my favorite is first person present because I like the immediacy. It also doesn't tell me whether or not the person lived to tell the tale, which I like. So with third person past, you know, or first person past, I know that they must have survived, or else I'm listening to a ghost. But for the most part, there is a sentient thing at the end of the story telling the story as it happened. With first person present, I don't know if they will survive. I don't know what's coming. So for me, that. Also, I think that really works in contemporary thrillers and horrors where the action is so fast paced. It just makes it feel immediate. For things like gothic or historical horrors, I think I probably prefer third person past because it gives this sense of timelessness and a slight distance. So I feel like an observer rather than a participant. So I think it depends on the genre or the subgenre.
What is your best piece of advice for somebody who would like to be a young adult horror author?
So I've got three. Maybe a bit more, but I'll try and keep it to three. One, to finish the book, because you can't start something unless you've got a book to go. You can't edit nothing, you can't submit nothing. So just finish the book. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to make it crappy at first, because you can edit something that's there but not a blank page. And as Neil Gaiman said, whatever it takes to finish it, do that. And the second piece of advice would be to, when you've got the book, polish it to the best of your ability. So especially in the YA market, I think the books that are successful are the ones that are close to publishing quality when you submit them to an agent. Because there are so many, it's so easy to pass because of silly mistakes. And the third one would just be to trust yourself. You can do it. You know, don't look outside of you for validation. Don't look outside of you for permission. Just trust that you can do it and just dare to do it. Dare to be yourself.
Yeah, it's great advice. And finally, my last question is, what do you believe the secret is to writing suspense and unease in fiction? What do you think is the one thing that separates really scary books from not so scary books?
I can tell you what works for me. For me, it's not giving me all the answers. So lack of knowledge. And a prime example of this for me is I love the film Sinister until the section in the film where all of the ghost children start jumping out. And you know what is making all of those noises. As soon as I had that knowledge, it was no longer scary to me. And it was such a shame because it was just such a fantastic study in lack of information. right? And he doesn't have control of the situation. That's another thing. I think a sense of wrongness, and I think House of Leaves does that really well. A sense that something isn't wrong, you don't know what it is. It's inferred, but it's not explained. For me personally, emotional and psychological threat more than physical threat. I don't know why. I think that's just particular to myself. And then just a build up and escalation of tension. So interpersonal tension, situational tension, tension with characters, and also something undefinable that I'm still trying to figure out about the conflict between what a character's internal need is and the world. I haven't quite put my finger on it yet, but it's something to do with a discordant note between those two things. And when I know what it is, I'll call you.
Yeah, please do. We'll make another video about it.
I mean, honestly, I think you could talk about these topics forever, and we could break down films and books that we love and talk about why. And I think actually that's more useful. I think it's more useful to take specific texts or video, because I'm a cinephile, I love film, and think about why specific elements affect you, because it's contextual.
Definitely. I mean, that would be very interesting to do a video like that.
Yeah, I'd love that. Absolutely love that, because I did that a lot when I was starting out. Because I didn't know about story structure. In fact, that's the thing that was the most difficult for me. Character, things like psychology, emotion, all that stuff was very instinctive, but I had to learn about structure. So what I did was I went to cinema and I broke down films into structure and themes and different elements and why they worked for me. In fact, there's a resource that I'll give to anyone who's watching if you are looking for a bit of guidance. Something that I found really helpful was this author. She used to have a blog. It's archived now, but you can access it, called Screenwriting Tricks for Novelists. And actually, she's released a book now. It's called Screenwriting Tricks for Novelists. And what she does is she draws a parallel between film and novels, and she breaks them down using real examples like The Matrix or Star Wars. Or I found that incredibly useful. Another resource that I found super useful, if anyone is at the stage of their career where they are pitching an agent or querying, look at the backs of DVDs. How do they summarize it? Like, I just went to my DVD collection. I was like, right, how are they telling me to pick this up and watch it? And they're not all great, but they're really good at getting to the point and using voice in that. Right. So I guess those are my two little things.
Yeah, I'm gonna find the Screenwriting Tips for Writers. I'll link it in the description of the video. No, screenwriting helped me so much. That helped me way more than any creative writing workshop that I did in school, because just learning about structure. And I did an independent study where I wrote a screenplay with a professor one-on-one, and we would just like talk about things and put them up on the whiteboard and like really break down why this has to happen. And he was really, really particular. Like, if something didn't have to happen, it wasn't supposed to be there. And that just, everything clicked in my head.
I mean, you know, and don't forget, the other thing is, don't forget your like middle school or primary school education. Don't forget your metaphor, your simile, your onomatopoeia. Don't forget those things you learned, because they're your tools, right? So how you use them is up to you, but you just use your arsenal, your inventory of tools. And and do read craft books, but don't take them super seriously. Take what you need, you scavenge what works for you, and just throw the rest away.
Yeah, definitely. Well, those are all the questions that I have. Thank you so much again for joining me. I feel like I've learned so much. It's been really, really wonderful. Can you tell everybody where they can find you and your books online?
Sure. I'm easiest to find on Instagram. I'm just at Dawn Kurtagich, DAWNKURTAGICH. And I'm pretty much that handle on Twitter, YouTube, most things. I'm just a Google away.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.